9,000 feet up a mountain road in Plumas National Forest, a car sits alone in the snow. The doors are unlocked. The keys are still in the ignition, and the 5 men who drove it there are gone, without a trace. Why would they leave a running vehicle, their only shelter, for a wall of snow and pine trees stretching in every direction? Why did some of them die within days, while one man's fate stayed unknown for over a year? Every choice these 5 men made that night worked against them, when the opposite choice would have kept them alive. This is the case of the Yuba County 5, and it comes with details that still don't add up. A thermos of hot coffee, a boot that didn't belong to the man wearing it, and a body positioned like he'd simply laid down to rest. Ted Wire, Jack Hewitt, Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias knew each other through a Sunday social club in Yuba County, California, a program built for adults with mild intellectual disabilities. They weren't strangers thrown together by chance. They were friends, regulars, the kind of group that showed up week after week because the routine mattered to them, because the club gave them something steady in lives that weren't always steady. On February 24th, 1978, the plan was simple. Drive from Marysville up to Chico, about 50 miles north, to watch a college basketball game between Chico State and UC Davis. Afterward, head home to Marysville and the neighboring town of Olivehurst. Madruga owned the car, a 1969 Mercury Montego, and he drove. He was the one with the license, the steady hands, the guy the others trusted behind the wheel. They'd made this drive before, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, as part of a routine that had become almost automatic. Chico to Marysville was familiar road. There was nothing about this trip that should have separated it from any other Sunday outing this group had taken together. Gary Mathias is worth pausing on here, because his background carries weight later in this story. Mathias had a documented history of mental illness, and at the time, he was taking medication to manage it. Friends and family who knew him described someone who functioned well under a stable routine, supported by his prescriptions and the structure the club provided. Take away that structure, or take away the medication, and the picture could shift. Investigators would return to this detail again and again as the case unfolded, because Mathias's mental state becomes one of the few threads that might explain what happened next, though even that thread never resolves cleanly. The game ended. Witnesses at the arena in Chico placed all 5 men together, leaving the venue in good spirits, walking normally, showing no sign of distress or conflict. No argument, no confusion, nothing that suggested anything was wrong. 5 men, 1 car, a straightforward drive home. The trip from Chico to Marysville takes about an hour. That's the drive Madruga had made before, the road he knew, the timeline that should have put all 5 men back in Olivehurst well before midnight. They never got there. Here's where the case stops making sense. The route from Chico to Marysville runs south, a straight shot down Highway 99, the kind of drive you could do half asleep after enough Sunday trips. But that's not the direction the Mercury Montego traveled. Instead, the car turned north and east, climbing into the Sierra Nevada foothills, then higher still into the Plumas National Forest, nearly 40 miles off the path home. Not a wrong turn you'd catch in a mile or two. 40 miles is an hour of driving in the opposite direction, on roads that get narrower and steeper the further you go. Why would 5 men who'd made this exact drive dozens of times suddenly end up on a mountain road at night in February, with snow already on the ground? That question sits at the center of everything that follows, and no piece of evidence collected in the decades since has answered it clean. What we do know is this: they were still together, and still functioning, after the game ended. Madruga stopped for gas in Marysville, close to home, close to the end of the drive they'd made so many times before. A clerk remembered him. The stop was normal. Nothing about it suggested panic or confusion, or a man about to steer his car in the wrong direction entirely. And yet somehow, from that gas station, the Montego kept moving north instead of turning toward Olivehurst. A Caltrans worker near Strawberry Valley, up in the mountains, remembered seeing a car matching the description that night. He remembered it because of where it was and when. Strawberry Valley sits along a road that, in late February, gets hit with snow and ice, the kind of terrain a highway worker pays attention to, because cars that don't belong up there tend to end up in ditches, or worse. His account placed the Montego on that mountain road hours after the game, hours after the men should have been home already. So, what happened between the gas station in Marysville and that mountain road above Strawberry Valley? Investigators have spent decades sitting with the same short list of possibilities, and none of them fit without leaving something unexplained. Maybe it was a wrong turn. Somebody got the roads confused in the dark, and instead of correcting course, they just kept going. Maybe something on the road startled them. Another driver, a confrontation, a reason to keep moving instead of stopping. Maybe the car had trouble, mechanical or otherwise, and Madruga tried to find a way around it that only led him deeper into the mountains. Or maybe the answer sits with Gary Mathias, and whatever was happening in his mind that night pulled the group somewhere none of them intended to go. None of these theories explain everything. All of them leave gaps. What isn't a theory, what's a fact, is where that car ended up next. Weeks later, buried in snow on a logging road far from any highway, the Mercury Montego would be found. And what searchers found inside it, and around it, only made the mystery harder to explain. 5 weeks passed before anyone found the car. It turned up on a logging road deep in the Plumas National Forest, well off any route a search team would think to check first, sitting in snow but not buried by it. Stuck, yes. Trapped, no. The kind of stuck where a driver could rock it forward, spin the tires a few times, and probably walk it free, or at minimum, give it enough of a push to get moving again. That detail matters because of what investigators found once they got close enough to look inside. The doors were unlocked. The keys sat in the ignition, right where Madruga would have left them if he'd only stepped out for a minute. There was no engine trouble, no busted radiator, no dead battery, nothing mechanical that would explain 5 men abandoning the vehicle in the middle of a February night in the mountains. And the gas tank still had fuel in it, plenty of it, enough to keep an engine running for hours if someone had simply stayed inside and turned the key. Sit with that for a second, because it's the detail that reframes everything else in this case. A stalled car in the snow is a survival problem with a fairly obvious answer. You stay with it. You run the engine in short bursts for heat. You wait for daylight or for another vehicle to come down the same road behind you. Cold kills slowly if you're sheltered, and fast if you're not. This car offered shelter. It offered warmth. It offered a sealed metal box that stood between 5 men and a mountain forest in the dead of winter, and none of that shelter got used the way you'd expect. Investigators checked the vehicle for anything missing, anything that would point to a deliberate decision to hike out for help. Blankets, food, tools, anything the men might have grabbed on their way out the door. There wasn't much. No sign of the kind of packing a person does when they've decided, calmly and rationally, that walking is safer than waiting. Whatever happened, it didn't look planned. What searchers found near the car told a different story. Footprints, preserved in the snow well enough to track, led away from the Mercury Montego in 2 separate paths. Not one group of 5 men moving together toward the nearest sign of civilization. 2 groups, splitting off from each other, both walking further from the road, further from any town, further from the one structure that offered heat, shelter, and a way to signal for help if anyone drove by. The psychology of this moment is worth sitting with, because it's the detail that never gets easier to explain the more you learn about the case. These weren't men unfamiliar with cold weather or completely without judgment. They knew each other. They'd spent years together through their Sunday club, trusted each other enough to pile into one car for a routine trip to a basketball game. And somewhere in the dark, on a mountain road at 9,000 feet, that group broke apart and walked into terrain that offered nothing. No trail markers, no cabins, no clear path back to a highway. They left the shelter to find something worse. What sent them there, whether it was panic, confusion, or something else no one has ever pinned down, remains one of the open questions at the center of this case. But their decision to leave triggered one of the largest search efforts Yuba County had ever mounted, a search that would cover miles of brutal winter terrain and still come up empty for months. Once the Mercury Montego turned up, Yuba County authorities launched one of the biggest search operations the region had seen. Volunteers poured in from the surrounding towns, joined by trained search dogs and aircraft, flying grid patterns over the forest. Search and rescue teams walked the ridgelines near where the car had been found, calling out 5 names into terrain that gave nothing back. The mountains made every part of it harder. Snow sat deep across the Plumas National Forest that winter, in places well over a man's knees, the kind of snowpack that swallows footprints within hours and turns a half-mile hike into an afternoon of exhausting work. Temperatures dropped hard at night, cold enough to threaten the searchers themselves, and low clouds kept grounding the aircraft that might have spotted something from above. Visibility came and went with the weather, and crews on foot could only cover so much ground before the light failed and they had to turn back. Days passed, then weeks, and the search that started with volunteers combing every drainage and ridge near the car began to shrink. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because the terrain and the season made it nearly impossible to keep going at that scale. Search and rescue teams have to weigh resources against odds, and as the weeks stretched on with no sign of any of the 5 men, that math got harder to justify. The search scaled back. Smaller crews, fewer flights, a slower pace, while 5 families kept waiting for word that never came. That stretch of waiting deserves its own kind of attention, separate from the search itself. Put yourself in the position of a parent or a sibling during those weeks. No remains, no confirmed sighting, no mechanical failure to point to, no obvious accident to explain, just a car sitting empty in the snow and 2 sets of footprints leading nowhere. Families in Marysville and Olivehurst sat with a silence that offered no shape to grieve and no evidence to hope with, an in-between that can wear on people worse than bad news itself. And here's the detail that makes this stretch of the case even harder to accept in hindsight. Search crews had walked, driven, and flown over ground that, it would later turn out, sat far closer to some of the missing men than anyone realized at the time. Somewhere out past the edge of every grid pattern, at least one of the 5 men was still alive, waiting, while the search above him kept moving on. It would take 4 more months, and a pair of campers with no connection to the case at all, before the first answer came out of that forest. What they found would set a timeline in motion that still doesn't sit right with investigators today. June brought the first answer, though it came from people who had nothing to do with the case at all. A pair of campers, working their way through a stretch of the Plumas National Forest, miles from where the Mercury Montego had been found, came across a Forest Service trailer tucked away from any road most people would think to check. Inside, they found the body of Ted Weher. 4 months had passed since the basketball game in Chico. The trailer itself raises the first hard question. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't bare. Whoever stocked it had left blankets, a supply of matches, and a small stove designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Heat and shelter for someone caught in the mountains during winter. Everything a person would need to survive sat inside those 4 walls. Weher had found that shelter. He'd made it inside, and he died there anyway. His body told investigators he hadn't died quickly. Weher had lost weight, an enormous amount of it, close to 100 pounds by later estimates, the kind of loss that doesn't happen in days. It happens over weeks, maybe longer. A body slowly consuming itself with nothing coming in to replace what it burned. Whatever killed Ted Weher, it wasn't the first cold night in that forest. He survived out there for an extended stretch, alone, before his body gave out. Here's where the trailer stops making sense. The matches sat unused. The stove, capable of throwing off enough heat to keep a man alive through a Sierra winter, showed no sign of ever being lit. Investigators found food inside as well, some of it eaten, some of it left untouched in its packaging, sitting within reach of a man who was slowly starving to death a few feet away. A person freezing to death doesn't usually ignore the one tool built to keep him warm, and a person starving doesn't typically leave food unopened beside him. One detail from the scene deserves particular caution because it's been reported more than it's been confirmed. Accounts describe a thermos or container with what seemed to be coffee, still holding some warmth, found near Weyer. If accurate, it raises a question with no clean answer, since coffee doesn't stay warm for 4 months on its own. Investigators never nailed down exactly what that detail meant, or when it originated, and it remains one of the stranger notes attached to this case, rather than a confirmed piece of evidence. Not far from the trailer, searchers located a second body. Bill Sterling had died within reach of the same shelter Weyer used, though his position told a somewhat different story. Where Weyer's remains suggested a long, slow decline inside 4 walls, Sterling's location and condition pointed to a man who may have tried to move to look for something beyond the trailer before the cold caught up with him. 2 men, the same patch of forest, the same missing explanation for why the tools meant to save them went unused. That left 3 names still unaccounted for. 2 of them hadn't been anywhere near that trailer at all, and their remains, once found, would only widen the distance between what happened to this group and any theory that could hold all 5 men inside one clean explanation. Jack Hewitt's remains turned up separately, in a location that put more distance between him and the trailer than investigators expected. His body was found in a stretch of forest that suggested he'd split off early, moving in a direction that took him further from Weyer and Sterling rather than toward them. Whatever decision sent that group of footprints splitting into 2 paths near the car, Hewitt's path kept diverging from there. He never crossed back. Madruga's remains turned up closer to where this whole search began, near the Mercury Montego itself. That location raises a different question than the one Hewitt's does. Investigators have floated the idea that Madruga tried to stay near the car, or at least tried to make his way back to it after the group split, since his position put him within a reasonable range of the vehicle, rather than deep in the terrain where the others ended up. If that's true, it means the man who owned the car, who drove it every Sunday, who knew it better than anyone in that group, still didn't make it back inside. Line these locations up on a map, and the case gets harder to hold together, not easier. Weyer and Sterling near the trailer, Hewitt well off in another direction, Madruga back near the car. 5 men who left a basketball game together, who trusted each other enough to pile into one Mercury Montego for a routine Sunday drive, ended up scattered across miles of forest, each of them dying essentially alone. That's the detail worth sitting with. Why would a group like this split apart at all, in a situation where every basic instinct about survival points towards staying together? Body heat matters in cold weather. So does shared judgment. One person catching a mistake, another might make alone. A group that stays together can take turns resting, can pool whatever supplies they're carrying, can make decisions collectively instead of one confused mind wandering off on its own logic. None of that happened here. Instead, the group broke into pieces, and every piece went a different direction, into terrain that offered nothing to any of them. Experts who've studied hypothermia point to something called cold-related confusion, a state where the brain, starved of the temperature it needs to function, starts making decisions that look irrational from the outside. Paradoxical undressing falls under that same umbrella. Cases where people dying of exposure tear off their own clothing in their final stretch, convinced they're overheating when the opposite is true. It's a real phenomenon, documented in other hypothermia deaths, but it doesn't fully explain a group splitting apart this early, or why the choice to leave a running car in the first place ever got made. It's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. And that picture stayed incomplete for a lot longer than anyone expected, because one member of this group wasn't found in 1978 at all. Gary Mathias, the man whose mental state investigators had flagged from the very beginning, remained missing long after his 4 friends had already been buried. 4 bodies, 4 families with an answer, even if that answer came wrapped in details nobody could fully explain. Gary Mathias made none of them. 5. He stayed missing, and that single fact kept the whole case open, kept it in local headlines, kept investigators working a file that refused to close the way the others had. Over a year passed before anything connected to Mathias turned up at all. And even then, what searchers found wasn't a body. It was pieces, scattered personal items linked back to him, found well after the search for the others had wound down. No remains ever came with them. No scene that let investigators say with certainty this is where he died, or when. A confirmed body closes a case. Scattered items don't. They just tell you someone passed through, and then stop talking. Go back to what we know about Mathias, because it matters more here than anywhere else in this story. He'd carried a diagnosed mental illness for years before that February night, managed through medication that friends and family said kept him steady, kept him functioning inside the routine his Sunday club offered. Take a man like that and put him through 4 months, 6 months, a year, in unfamiliar terrain, likely without whatever prescription had been keeping his mind level. And you're not looking at the same person who walked out of that basketball game in Chico. That gap, the space between who Mathias was on medication and who he might have become without it, is where one theory tries to live. Investigators considered the idea that his mental state, unmanaged and untreated for an extended stretch, could account for decisions that look erratic from the outside, wandering further from the group, surviving in ways that left no trace, maybe even staying alive well past when his friends had died, if his mind and body handled the ordeal differently than theirs did. It's a theory, not a finding, and it's worth saying that plainly. Nobody proved what Gary Mathias experienced in those months. They only guessed, based on what they knew about him going in. That guesswork got fuel from what came next. Reports came in for years afterward. People who claimed to have seen a man matching his description in towns near the forest, sometimes further out. None of it held up under investigation. None of it produced Mathias, or a body, or an ending. But it kept his name circulating long after Weyer, Sterling, Hute, and Madruga had been buried, and the newspapers had mostly moved on. A missing man with no remains leaves room for rumor, and this case had more room than most. By the time investigators accepted that Mathias likely died somewhere in that same stretch of wilderness, sometime during those unaccounted for months, the broader case had already outgrown any single answer. 4 confirmed deaths with no clean explanation for the choices that caused them. 1 presumed death with no scene at all, and an investigation that, despite the effort poured into it, was about to run into the same wall from every direction it tried. Strip away the specific names and locations, and investigators were left holding 4 theories, none of them complete on their own. The first theory says this started as a wrong turn, the kind that happens to anyone driving unfamiliar roads at night, except panic took over once the men realized how far off course they'd gone. A wrong turn compounded by panic could explain the drive north. It doesn't explain why they left a running car with fuel in the tank. The second theory involves someone else entirely, a chase or an altercation on that mountain road that forced Madruga to keep driving, then forced all 5 men out of the vehicle before they were ready. It's a theory that would account for the direction, the timing, maybe even the panic that split the group apart. But no one who worked this case ever found the man, or evidence of the man, who could have caused it. The third theory leans on the cold itself, the same hypothermia-driven confusion that showed up earlier in this story. A mind losing its grip on basic judgment the longer it sat exposed to freezing temperatures. And the fourth circles back to Gary Mathias. Whatever was happening in his mind that night, unmedicated and untethered from the routine that usually kept him steady. 4 theories. Investigators never landed on just one. What they didn't find matters as much as what they did. No defensive wounds turned up on any of the 4 recovered bodies. No signs of a struggle, no torn clothing consistent with a fight. No indication that another person had been anywhere near these men in their final hours. Whatever happened to the Yuba County Five, it wasn't violence. Nobody attacked them. Nobody chased them at gunpoint into that forest. The physical evidence, as far as it goes, rules out the version of this story where a stranger forced their hand. But here's the counterpoint that never stops nagging at anyone who studies this case closely. An absence of violence doesn't explain an abundance of bad decisions. These were capable men. Madruga drove that route for years without incident. The group had structure, routine, familiarity with each other and with the road. Ruling out foul play tells you what didn't happen. It says nothing about why 5 men, given every opportunity to stay warm and stay together, chose instead to walk into terrain that killed them one by one. Investigators at the time settled on accidental death from exposure, and on paper, that conclusion fits the physical facts. Cold kills. These men died cold, in a forest, without adequate shelter for most of the time they spent out there. But settle into that conclusion for more than a minute, and the details start pushing back against it. Exposure doesn't usually explain unused matches sitting a few feet from a dying man. It doesn't explain untouched food beside food that had been eaten. It doesn't explain 2 groups of footprints walking away from a car that still had gas in the tank. The label fit the cause of death. It never fully fit the story. Locally, this case became something law enforcement still brings up when cold cases come up in conversation, a reference point for what an investigation looks like when every answer only raises another question. Decades on, detectives who've reviewed the file describe the same frustration original investigators had: a manner of death without a motive, a conclusion without closure. What's left then isn't a solved case. It's a set of facts that never assembled into a clean story, no matter how many times someone's tried. 5 families buried their sons, their brothers, their friends with a cause of death on paper and nothing underneath it that made sense. Exposure, cold. That's what the report said. It never said why, and it never said what these men experienced in the days or months before their bodies gave out. In Marysville and Olivehurst, that gap between the official cause and the actual truth became something the community carried for years, not because anyone doubted the men had died from the cold, but because nobody could explain how they'd ended up exposed to it in the first place. The case did leave a mark beyond the families, in ways that took time to show up. Search and rescue operations in California started paying closer attention to how they handled cases involving adults with intellectual disabilities, adjusting protocols around how quickly to escalate a search and how to think about decision-making that might not follow typical patterns of panic or survival instinct. Conversations about mental health and outdoor emergencies got sharper too, particularly around what happens when someone goes missing without their medication and how that absence might shape behavior in ways searchers hadn't accounted for before. None of it undid what happened in 1978. It just meant the next case, somewhere else, might get handled with sharper eyes. Go back to the details one more time, because they're the reason this case still gets discussed decades later. A thermos that may have held warm coffee, found near a man who'd been dead for months. In a mystery nobody's resolved. Matches sitting unused beside a body that needed heat more than anything else in the world. A boot that didn't match the man wearing it. A small detail buried inside a much larger one, but strange enough on its own to make investigators pause. None of these details changes the manner of death. All of them keep the case from feeling finished. Officially, the file closed as accidental death from exposure, and it stayed that way for decades. Yuba County never reopened it as a homicide, never introduced a suspect, never revised the finding despite everything that doesn't sit right about it. But official and settled aren't the same thing. Ask anyone who's read the file, the searchers who worked the case, the investigators who came after and tried to make sense of it fresh. The paperwork says accidental. The details never let it feel that way. 5 men left a basketball game in Chico, expecting to be home within the hour. Instead, They drove into a mystery that outlived every one of them, one that still doesn't add up, more than 4 decades later. A man lies against a sea wall, feet crossed, hands still, like he simply chose that spot to fall asleep. No wallet in his pocket, no name stitched into his collar, no papers that say who he was or where he came from. Investigators would eventually pull a scrap of paper from a hidden seam in his trousers, a phrase printed on it in a foreign script, Tamam Shud, Persian, meaning it is ended. Tucked behind that paper waits a code, 5 lines of jumbled letters that nobody, not the Navy, not the code breakers, not a single amateur with a magnifying glass, has ever managed to crack. Who was this man? How did he die? And who erased every trace of him before anyone found the body? To understand that, we have to go back to Adelaide, South Australia, in December of 1948, right as the Cold War was settling over the world like a second skin. This is the story of the Somerton Man. The evening of November 30th, 1948, was warm along Somerton Park Beach, a quiet stretch of sand near Glenelg, a seaside suburb about 7 miles southwest of Adelaide. Families still lingered near the water. The heat hadn't broken yet, and the kind of stillness that settles over a beach town at dusk had started to take hold. Around 7 o'clock, a couple walking the sand noticed a man lying back against the sea wall, legs stretched out in front of him, ankles crossed like he'd settled in for a rest. As they passed, they watched him raise his right arm straight up into the air, hold it there for a moment, then let it drop back down into the sand. Odd, maybe, but not alarming. People acted strange on beaches all the time. 30 minutes later, between 7:30 and 8, a second couple walked the same stretch. This time, the man hadn't moved. Mosquitoes had gathered on his face, and he made no effort to wave them off. No twitch, no reaction at all. The boyfriend joked that the man must be dead to the world not to notice the bugs crawling over his skin. They assumed he was drunk. Maybe asleep. Nothing about a motionless man on a beach at night, in 1948, struck anyone as a reason to call for help. What should have caught their attention was what he was wearing. This wasn't a man dressed for the sand. He had on a full suit, white shirt, a red, white and blue tie, a knitted pullover under a fashionable double-breasted jacket, and shoes buffed to a mirror shine. Nobody walks down to swim in that. Nobody lies down for a nap in that. But the heat of the evening and the ordinary laziness of beachgoers meant 2 separate sets of witnesses walked right past him, and neither one asked the obvious question. Why is a man dressed for an office lying in the sand like he's already given up on the day? By morning, the question didn't matter anymore. At 6:30 on the morning of December 1st, jeweler John Lyons came back from an early swim and found a small group of people gathered near the sea wall. He walked over and saw the same man, same position, head against the wall, legs out, ankles crossed. Only now, the body was cold. A half-smoked cigarette rested on the collar of his coat, like it had slipped from his lips at the exact moment his hand stopped working. There was no blood, no bruising, no sign of a struggle, nothing torn or displaced, nothing to suggest violence had touched him at all. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had simply stopped, mid-thought, mid-breath, and never started again. That stillness would define the entire case for the next 70 years. Lyons called the police, and by 6:30 that morning, Adelaide had a body with no name and no explanation, and an investigation that was about to run into wall after wall after wall. At the mortuary, pathologist John Burton Cleland got his first real look at the man who had died without a name. He guessed the age at somewhere between 40 and 45, noted the Britisher appearance in his notes, the kind of phrase investigators used at the time to describe a man who looked like he belonged to the English-speaking world. Whatever had killed him, it hadn't wasted away his body first. He was in what Cleland called top physical condition. Broad shoulders, a narrow waist, grey eyes, hair somewhere between fair and ginger, going slightly grey at the temples. This was not a sick man. This was not a man anyone expected to find dead on a beach. Then came the details that didn't fit anywhere. His calf muscles were high and unusually well developed, more like the legs of an athlete than a man in his 40s. His big toes and little toes met in a strange wedge shape, the kind Cleland associated with men who spent years wearing tight, pointed shoes. One expert at the inquest went so far as to guess the man might have been a dancer, someone who'd spent a career balancing on the balls of his feet. Others thought boots, the high-heeled kind worn by men who rode horses for a living. And his hands told their own story, soft, uncalloused, no sign he'd done a day of manual labor in his life. Whoever this man was, he hadn't spent his years swinging an axe or hauling rope. He'd spent them doing something else entirely, something that left no mark on his palms at all. Then investigators turned to his clothes, and that's where the case stopped making sense. Every single label had been removed, not torn out carelessly, but cut away with what looked like real attention, like someone had gone through his wardrobe piece by piece and erased any thread that might point back to a name, a tailor, a city. He wore no hat, which in 1948 was almost as strange as wearing no shoes at all. Men didn't leave the house bareheaded back then, not if they could help it. And he carried no wallet, no cash, no cards, nothing that told anyone who he'd been that morning before he became a body on a beach. His pockets held small scraps of an ordinary life, or what looked like one. An unused second-class rail ticket to Henley Beach, a bus ticket that may or may not have been used, a narrow aluminum comb, manufactured in America, a half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, a quarter-full box of matches, and a packet of Army Club cigarettes. That last item deserved a second look, because it wasn't quite what it claimed to be. Inside the Army Club packet sat 7 cigarettes of a completely different, more expensive brand, Kensitas. Someone had swapped the contents, kept the outer packet, and never bothered to explain why. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of detail that stuck with investigators for years, a tiny inconsistency in a man who seemed built entirely out of inconsistencies. None of it added up to a name. So, detectives did what any department would do next. They took his fingerprints and sent them out into the world, certain that somewhere, some file, some record would tell them who they'd found. The fingerprints went out first to every police station in Australia, then overseas to England and the United States. Nothing came back. Not a partial match, not a flagged file, not even a hint that this man had ever been arrested, fingerprinted, or processed by any system that kept records. Scotland Yard ran the prints through their files and found nothing. The FBI checked their own archives of domestic criminals and came up just as empty. A man who looked so ordinary, so unremarkable in a suit and tie, had somehow left no mark on any government's paperwork anywhere in the English-speaking world. So the police leaned on the public instead, and the public answered, though not in any way that helped. By early 1949, people were already showing up at the mortuary asking to view the body, certain they recognized him from a photo in the paper. A former woodcutter named Robert Walsh got named twice by different viewers, until one of them came back a second time, noticed the dead man's legs didn't match Walsh's scarred ones, and quietly retracted her identification. 2 men from Darwin swore the body belonged to a friend of theirs. Someone else insisted he'd been a station hand who never returned from a trip to buy sheep. A Swedish sailor's name got floated. A steamship worker's name got floated. None of it held up under a second look. By November of 1953, police had logged 251 separate solutions to the man's identity. Every single one of them submitted by someone who believed, at least for a moment, that they'd solved the case. Every single one of them wrong. None of this happened in a vacuum. Australia, in the years right after the war, was full of men who didn't quite fit anywhere anymore. Soldiers who'd shipped out as one person and came home as someone else, or didn't come home at all. Families that had lost track of a brother, a husband, a son, somewhere between one continent and another. The psychology of the moment is important here. Grief and uncertainty made people want an answer badly enough that they'd talk themselves into recognizing a stranger. It wasn't dishonesty. It was just how a country full of unresolved loss tried to close its own private wounds. Dental records offered one more avenue and one more dead end. Police compared the man's teeth against every record they could find and matched him to no one. No missing persons file, no dental office, no name anywhere on paper that lined up with the body in the morgue. At some point, the investigators had to face a colder fact. They couldn't hold on to a body forever while they waited for an identity that might never come. On December 10th, 1948, the man was embalmed, a step police openly admitted they'd never had to take before. It preserved him, and it preserved whatever evidence his body still carried. It also meant, without anyone quite realizing it yet, that they were sealing away DNA they wouldn't be able to properly use for another 70 years. The full autopsy came a day later, on December 2nd, and pathologist John Dwyer went looking for a cause of death that made sense. What he found instead was a body that seemed to argue with itself. The spleen sat at nearly 3 times its normal size, swollen and firm, in a way that shouldn't happen to a healthy man in his 40s. The liver was distended, packed with congested blood. Inside the stomach, mixed in with the last traces of food, Dwyer found blood that shouldn't have been there either. Every organ he opened told the same story. Something toxic had moved through this man's body and torn through it on the way out. The last meal backed up that story, at least at first. The man had eaten a pasty somewhere between 3 and 4 hours before he died, and Dwyer checked it for anything that might explain the damage. Nothing turned up. No trace of poison in the food itself, nothing that would explain a meal turning fatal on its way down. That's where the case folded in on itself. The organs looked exactly like poisoning. The behavior on the beach, the raised arm, the stillness, the failure to react to mosquitoes crawling across his face, read exactly like a man in the grip of something that was shutting his body down piece by piece. But when the toxicology tests came back, they found nothing. No barbiturates, no common poison. No known substance of any kind, sitting in his blood or his organs, waiting to be named. Dwyer said as much at the inquest the following year, and his own words carried the weight of a man who couldn't square what he'd seen with what he'd tested. "I was astounded that he found nothing," he admitted, referring to the chemist who ran the analysis. Astounded is the word a pathologist uses when the body tells one story and the lab tells another, and neither one gives ground. So the coroner brought in help. Cedric Stanton Hicks, a professor of pharmacology at the University of Adelaide, took the stand and offered the only theory that fit what Dwyer had documented. A glycoside poison, rare enough and unstable enough that it could break down in the body almost as fast as it killed, leaving nothing behind for a lab to catch. Hicks wouldn't say the names of the drugs out loud in open court. Instead, he wrote them down on a scrap of paper and passed it to the coroner in silence. Exhibit C. 18. 2 words that wouldn't reach the public for decades: digitalis and ouabain. Both drugs that, in the wrong dose, could stop a heart without leaving the kind of fingerprint a toxicologist could find. Even with Hicks's theory on the table, the coroner couldn't close the loop. He could say he believed the man died from a glycoside poison. He could say he didn't believe it was accidental. What he couldn't say was who gave it to him, or whether the man had taken it himself, standing on that beach in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. Months passed before anyone found the piece that mattered most, and it happened almost by accident. It was April of 1949, 4 months after the body turned up on the sand, and pathologist John Cleland sat down to go over the man's clothing one more time, inch by inch, the way you check a room after you've already lost something in it. Every other examiner had handled these clothes. Every other examiner had missed what Cleland found. Sewn into the waistband of the trousers, small enough to pass for a stitching floor, sat a fob pocket, the kind built to hold a pocket watch. Cleland reached inside and pulled out a tiny scrap of paper, rolled tight, no bigger than a fingernail. He unrolled it carefully. 2 words sat printed on it in an elegant, unusual typeset. Tamam Shud. Nobody on the case recognized the language. It took a newspaper reporter, Frank Kennedy, of the Adelaide Advertiser, to look at those 2 words and know exactly what he was looking at. Persian, he told police. And not just Persian, but a phrase lifted from somewhere specific, the final line of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 12th century poem that had found a second life in the English-speaking world through a translation everyone seemed to own a copy of at some point. Tamam Shud. It is ended. Finished. The poem itself carried weight beyond the phrase. Its whole argument was that a life should be lived without regret, that pleasure and experience mattered more than guilt, and that death, when it came, deserved to be met calmly rather than feared. It wasn't a poem about tragedy. It was a poem about acceptance. If this man had torn that page out himself, folded it down to nothing, and sewn it into a pocket most people didn't even know their own trousers had, he may have been carrying the closing line of his own story, written in someone else's words, tucked away where only a very determined search would ever find it. Police didn't have much else to work with, so they built an entire appeal around it. They published the phrase in the papers and asked the public for help finding one specific book, a copy of the Rubaiyat, missing its final page, the torn edge matching a scrap of paper no bigger than a stamp. It's an unusual thing to ask a country to do, hunt down a single used paperback among thousands, but it was the only lead standing between them and nothing at all. Sit with that image for a second. A man dies on a beach with no name, no wallet, nothing to say who he was, and the only words he leaves behind, hidden in a seam most men never check, tell you the ending was on purpose, not an accident, not a mystery to him, whatever it was to everyone else. Just 2 words, in a language most Australians couldn't read, saying it was over, before anyone even knew there was a story to finish. Weeks after the appeal ran in the papers, a man walked into the Adelaide Detective Office carrying a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, who led the investigation and had a habit of shielding witnesses from public attention, gave him a pseudonym in every official statement, Ronald Francis. His real name never made it into the record. He told police he'd been riding in his brother-in-law's car, an open-topped model that had been parked, unlocked, somewhere near Glenelg around the time the body turned up. The book was just sitting there, on the floor behind the seats, like someone had tossed it in and forgotten about it entirely. Under the microscope, the story checked out. The torn edge on the scrap of paper found in the dead man's trousers lined up with the missing page in the back of that book. Fibre for fibre, print for print. There was no ambiguity left in it. This was the book. Somebody had torn the final page out of this exact copy, folded the words Tamam Shud down small enough to hide, and sewn them into a seam most people would never think to check. Detectives turned the book over, and that's when the case took a sharp turn into something stranger. Under ultraviolet light, the back cover gave up faint indentations, the kind of pressure marks left behind when someone writes on a page resting on top of it and presses just hard enough to leave a ghost of the words underneath. A local phone number showed up first, then a second number, one nobody could immediately place. And beneath both, 5 lines of text, written in capital letters, faint but legible enough to copy down word for word, or letter for letter, since none of it read like actual words at all. At first, the detectives and the language experts they called in thought they were looking at a foreign language, something written by a man who'd learnt to write in a script none of them recognized. That theory held for a while, until someone pointed out that no language on Earth breaks itself into 5 short lines like that, with no obvious spacing, no repeated letter patterns you'd expect from real words. This wasn't a language, this was a code, or something built to look like one. One detail stood out from the rest. The second line had been struck through, a single stroke drawn clean across it. If this was a genuine cipher, That kind of correction makes sense. Anyone encoding a message by hand can slip, lose their place, misalign a letter, and the natural response is to cross it out and start the line again. It's the kind of small, human error you'd expect from someone working carefully under pressure, not from a man scribbling nonsense. Nobody could prove that's what happened. But that single struck-through line became one of the details researchers kept coming back to, decade after decade, because it suggested intention behind the letters, even if nobody could say what that intention was. The unlisted phone number was the only piece of the puzzle that felt solvable. It took real legwork, since numbers like that didn't sit in any public directory. But eventually it led detectives to a name and a woman living close enough to the beach to have heard about the body before the newspapers ever printed a word about it. Jessica Thompson. Jessica Thompson was 27 years old, working as a nurse, living on Mosley Street in Glenelg, close enough to the beach that she could have walked to the spot where the body was found in under 5 minutes. 400 meters. That's the whole distance between her front door and a dead man nobody could name. When detectives traced the unlisted number back to her address, she wasn't some stranger pulled out of a phone book at random. She was a woman who'd been living, quite literally, in the shadow of the entire investigation. She admitted something right away, and it didn't take much pressing. Years earlier, during the war, she'd owned a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the same book connected to the scrap of paper found sewn into the dead man's trousers. She said she'd given her copy to a man named Alfred Boxall, an Australian Army lieutenant she'd known while working in Sydney. Inside the front cover, she'd written an inscription, signing herself not as Jessica, but as Jestin. And underneath her name, she'd copied out a verse from the poem itself, one dealing with regret, with promises broken, with what the poem calls threadbare penitence. It's not the kind of verse you hand a casual acquaintance. It's the kind of thing you write for someone you were afraid of losing, or afraid you'd already hurt. For a moment, that inscription looked like the answer to everything. If Thompson had given this exact type of book to a man during the war, and this exact type of book connected directly to the corpse on Somerton Beach, then maybe, detectives thought, they'd finally have a name. Before that thread could be followed all the way, though, there's a moment in this case that still doesn't sit right with anyone who studied it closely. Detectives brought Thompson a plaster cast, made from the dead man's face and shoulders, built specifically because police worried they'd never get another chance at identification once the body went into the ground. They set it in front of her and waited. According to the detective who watched her react, Jessica Thompson looked as though she might actually faint. Not a polite grimace, not a brief flicker of discomfort. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean described her afterward as completely taken aback, a woman who seemed to be fighting to stay upright in front of the exact bust she claimed meant nothing to her. And yet, once she'd steadied herself, she told police plainly that she didn't know the man. Nobody in that room believed her. You don't nearly go down at the sight of a stranger's face. Whatever she saw in that plaster, whatever memory or fear it dragged up, she kept it locked behind a flat denial, and she never once cracked that denial for the rest of her life. Then came a request that would end up shaping the entire case for decades afterward. Thompson asked police not to release her name to the public, not to keep a permanent record tying her to the investigation. She said it would damage her reputation to be linked to an unidentified dead man under such strange circumstances. Police agreed, and at the time, it must have seemed like a small courtesy. In hindsight, it was a decision that crippled the case. Researchers spent the next 50 years chasing pseudonyms, trying to confirm facts about a woman whose real name wasn't even publicly settled until the 2000s. One more detail deserves attention, because Thompson volunteered it herself, unprompted. She told detectives that sometime before the body was found, an unfamiliar man had come around her neighborhood asking after her, speaking to her neighbors while she happened to be away. She never explained who he might have been. She never said whether she connected him to the man in the morgue. What's left is a woman standing at the center of every thread in this case, without ever explaining a single one of them. 400 meters from the body, connected by a phone number, connected by a book she gave to someone else entirely, nearly fainting at a face she swore she didn't know, and asking, quietly, to disappear from the record before anyone could ask her why. For a short stretch, detectives believed they'd solved the entire case without ever leaving the room. Jessica Thompson had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man named Alfred Boxall. That same type of book connected directly to the corpse on Somerton Beach. Simple math said Boxall had to be the dead man, and for a few days, the investigation ran on that assumption alone. Except Boxall wasn't dead. Detectives found him alive and working in Sydney at the Randwick bus depot, back in the same maintenance job he'd held before the war. When they asked to see his copy of the Rubaiyat, he handed it over without any hesitation at all. The final page sat right where it should, Tamam Shud, printed clean and intact, nothing torn, nothing missing. So now the case had something almost worse than a dead end. It had two separate copies of the same rare book, both connected to the same woman, one resting untouched on a living man's shelf in Sydney, the other torn apart and sewn into the trousers of a man nobody could name. That kind of coincidence doesn't hand you an answer. It just sits there, refusing to explain why one man walked away clean while the other ended up in a morgue. In 1978, journalist Stuart Littlemore sat down with Boxall for an Australian television documentary and pushed him directly on whether his connection to Jessica Thompson ran deeper than a wartime friendship, whether there might be an intelligence angle nobody had considered. Boxall brushed the idea off almost immediately. He called it quite a melodramatic thesis, and denied Thompson could have known anything about intelligence work he'd done, unless somebody else had told her first. That denial carries more weight once you look at his service record. Boxall hadn't spent the war doing routine duty. He'd served initially with a water transport company, before getting pulled into a special operations unit. And once he got there, his rank jumped from lance corporal to lieutenant in a matter of months. The kind of fast promotion that usually points to something more specialized than paperwork and supply runs. None of that proves he was involved in anything connected to the Somerton man. But it's one more loose thread in a case built almost entirely out of them, and it landed at exactly the moment the public was primed to see spies everywhere they looked, because 1948 wasn't a quiet year to die under strange circumstances. The Cold War had just started settling into place, and Australia sat close to targets any foreign intelligence service would want to look at. A uranium mine, a joint military testing range, secrets worth having. A man with no name, no fingerprints on file anywhere, a coded message in his pocket, and a connection to a woman who reportedly spoke Russian. That's not a set of facts people were willing to file away as coincidence. Whether any of it held up under scrutiny is a different question entirely. But it's exactly the atmosphere that turns an unsolved death into a national obsession that outlives everyone involved in it. The 5 lines scrawled across the back of that Rubaiyat became the piece of this case that refused to let go. And it started with the country's best codebreakers taking a swing at it almost immediately. Police sent copies to naval intelligence within days, hoping military-grade cryptography could do what a room full of detectives couldn't. The answer that came back was almost deflating. Naval intelligence concluded there simply weren't enough letters to draw any real conclusion. Their assessment raised the possibility that the text wasn't a code at all, but something closer to a memory aid, the first letters of words from a poem or a verse. Something meant to jog a private thought rather than hide a secret message from anyone. For a case that had already swallowed a coded message whole, that's an unsatisfying answer. It's also an honest one. 40-some letters isn't much to build a cipher on, and without more text, there was no clean way to prove it either way. That didn't stop the public from trying anyway. Once newspapers printed the code, amateur codebreakers across the country mailed in theory after theory, almost none of it built on anything resembling real method. It's the kind of flood that shows up in any case involving a cipher. People want to be the one who cracks it, and a handful of scrawled letters becomes an invitation nobody can resist. 30 years later, In 1978, the Australian Department of Defence took their own pass at it, after the same journalist who'd interviewed Boxall pushed for a fresh review. Their cryptographers landed on almost the identical conclusion naval intelligence had reached decades before. The text was too short to prove it was a genuine cipher, and it was entirely possible the letters were nothing more than the meaningless output of a mind under strain, a phrase that lands differently once you remember a man died not long after apparently writing them. The case sat mostly untouched after that, until Professor Derek Abbott at the University of Adelaide picked it back up in the 2000s with a more modern approach. Abbott's team ran a statistical analysis on the letters, comparing their frequency against random distributions and against the actual text of the Rubaiyat, trying to determine whether the pattern looked like a genuine code, a form of shorthand, or plain noise dressed up to look meaningful. Their conclusion leaned toward the letters being initials, each one standing in for the first letter of a word rather than a substitution cipher built to hide anything. That's a real distinction. It suggests a man jotting down the bones of a private thought rather than sending a message meant for someone else's eyes. One theory that grew out of this research sounds almost deflating next to decades of spy talk. The letters might represent nothing more than shorthand notes, or, oddly enough, the names of racehorses. Nobody's proven it. Nobody's ruled it out either. In 2014, computational linguist John Railing ran his own detailed analysis and reached a conclusion that closed the door without ever fully opening it. His research backed the theory that the letters were initials of English words, but after searching an enormous body of literature for a match, he found nothing that fit cleanly. His final judgment was that the letters were most likely personal shorthand, not a formal code, and that the original words behind them may never surface again, not because nobody's looked hard enough, but because whatever they were built from may simply be gone. While the code sat unsolved in a police file, another piece of evidence had already been waiting, untouched, in plain sight for weeks. On January 14th, 1949, staff at the Adelaide railway station found a brown suitcase sitting in the cloakroom, its identifying tag torn away. Records showed it had been checked in sometime after 11 that morning on November 30th, the same day the man was last seen alive on the beach. Inside, investigators found a pocket that had been carefully mended with an unusual variety of orange waxed thread, not the kind of thread you could easily buy in Australia at the time. That detail mattered immediately, because it was the exact same thread used to repair a pocket in the trousers the dead man had been wearing when he died. Two separate pieces of clothing, mended by the same hand, with the same unusual material. That's not a coincidence anyone could wave away. The rest of the suitcase read like a kit built for a life spent working with his hands, carefully and without waste. A table knife, its handle cut down and sharpened into something closer to a small blade. A pair of scissors with the points filed off and sharpened again. A stencil brush, the exact type used by third officers on merchant ships to mark cargo crates. None of it screamed danger on its own. Together, it painted a picture of a man used to improvising tools. Maybe a man who'd spent time working around ships or freight. Someone precise. Someone who didn't waste anything. And then there were the name tags. 3 items, marked Keane in slightly different forms, stitched into a tie, a laundry bag, an undershirt. Detectives chased that name hard, running it through every missing persons file they could find. Nobody named Keane had vanished anywhere in the English-speaking world that matched this man. The likeliest explanation, the one police settled on at the time, was second-hand clothing, items passed down or bought used, with someone else's name left behind, either missed during the effort to erase every other trace of identity, or left there on purpose because the dead man knew Keane wasn't his name and didn't care if anyone found it. Either way, the lead went nowhere. Around this same stretch, a separate case surfaced that some investigators quietly connected to Somerton, though nobody ever confirmed the link. Months after the body was found, A father and his young son were discovered in the sand dunes some distance up the coast. A witness trying to help piece together whether that case connected to the Somerton man began receiving threats not long after. Somebody wanted that line of inquiry to stop. Whether it had anything to do with the man on the beach, or was just a grim coincidence tangled up in the same news cycle, was never settled. Over the decades that followed, the evidence had a habit of thinning out. Witness statements disappeared from the official file, not all at once, but slowly, the kind of erosion that happens to a case nobody's quite responsible for anymore. In 1986, the suitcase itself, along with everything inside it, was destroyed, marked as no longer needed. Nobody could have known then how much later forensic science would want exactly that kind of physical evidence back. And for years after his burial, flowers kept turning up on his grave at West Terrace Cemetery, left by someone nobody could name. Police once stopped a woman leaving the cemetery and asked her about it. She said she knew nothing. The flowers kept coming anyway, for years, long after anyone expected this case to still matter to a living soul. By the time DNA science advanced far enough to offer real hope, more than 70 years had already passed. For years, the only real hope of putting a name to this man sat 6 feet underground, and for years, nobody would let anyone dig it up. Researchers pushed repeatedly for exhumation, and repeatedly, the answer came back, no. In 2011, South Australia's Attorney General rejected the request outright, stating there needed to be public interest reasons that went well beyond simple curiosity or general scientific interest. It's a reasonable bureaucratic line to draw. It's also maddening if you're convinced the answer to a 70-year mystery is lying right there, waiting, and the only thing standing between you and it is paperwork. That changed in October of 2019, when a new Attorney General granted conditional approval on the condition that interested parties covered the cost themselves. The exhumation finally happened on May 19, 2021. Police reported the remains sat deeper in the ground than anyone had expected, but they came up in what officials called reasonable condition, enough to give real hope that something usable might still survive after 7 decades underground. The DNA work fell to Professor Derek Abbott, who'd been chasing this case for over a decade by that point, working alongside American genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. Their best evidence didn't come from the freshly exhumed remains at all. It came from hair, a few strands caught in the plaster cast made of the man's face and shoulders. Back in 1949, the same cast Jessica Thompson had nearly fainted looking at. 70 years later, that hair still held enough genetic material to work with. Using it, Abbott and Fitzpatrick built out a family tree stretching across thousands of names, cross-referencing distant genetic cousins on public databases until the branches finally converged on one person. On July 26, 2022, they announced it to the world. The Somerton man, they believed, was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker, born November 16, 1905, in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne. Webb's life, once researchers started pulling at it, looked nothing like the spies and dancers the public had spent decades imagining. He was the youngest of 6 children born to a German immigrant father who ran a bakery. In 1941, he married Dorothy Robertson, a pharmacist and chiropodist, and by every account she gave afterward, the marriage was not a kind one. Dorothy described Carl as solitary, a man with few friends who kept to himself, went to bed by 7 every night, and turned moody and violent whenever he felt he was losing an argument, even over something trivial. He wrote poetry, and most of it, according to Dorothy, circled back to death, a subject she said he described as his greatest desire. In March of 1946, she found him in bed after what looked like a suicide attempt, an overdose of ether. She nursed him back to health. He responded by becoming more violent toward her, not less. By September of that year, she'd had enough, and she left him after years of physical and verbal abuse. Carl moved out in 1947, and from that point on, There's no official record of where he went or what he did next. He simply dropped out of the paper trail of his own life, more than a year before a man matching his description turned up dead on a beach in another state. Despite how strong Abbott and Fitzpatrick's genetic work looked, South Australia police have never officially confirmed it. They called themselves cautiously optimistic, acknowledged the findings, but stopped short of formal verification, saying they were still investigating and waiting on further DNA work before any coroner made a final ruling. That confirmation still hasn't come. Here's the irony underneath all of it. Even if the name Carl Webb is correct, even if science finally closed the gap after more than 70 years, none of the actual mystery has moved an inch. Nobody knows why he left his wife and vanished in 1947. Nobody knows why Adelaide, or why that beach, or why that night. Nobody knows if he poisoned himself or if someone else did it for him. A name changes what you call him. It doesn't explain a single choice that put him on that sand, motionless, waiting for a morning he'd never see. Maybe he finally has a name. But how he died, why he chose that beach, and what Jessica Thompson recognized in his face and refused to say out loud, all of it stays sealed shut, exactly the way it's been for over 75 years. His grave in Adelaide is still there. People still visit it. Sit with that for a moment before you go. Let's get to the second story. 4 bodies, sealed inside industrial barrels, left in a New Hampshire state park for decades, without names, without a killer, without a single answer for the families who spent years wondering where their loved ones went. Who were they? Who put them there? And why did it take investigators nearly 40 years to answer either question? This case became something bigger than a single crime scene. It became the reason genetic genealogy exists as a tool in criminal investigations today, a technique now used to crack cold cases across the entire country. But before any of that science existed, there was just a hunter, a drum in the underbrush, and a discovery that would sit unsolved for a generation. Bear Brook State Park sits in Allenstown, New Hampshire, the kind of place families visit for hiking trails and quiet picnic spots, not the kind of place anyone expects to find a crime scene. In hindsight, that's part of what made this case so unsettling. The park was ordinary, unremarkable, a patch of New England woods that could have belonged to any town in the state. On November 10th, 1985, a hunter moved through the underbrush near the site of a burned-down store, and he came across something that didn't belong there, a rusted, 55-gallon industrial drum, half hidden beneath years of fallen branches and leaf rot. The kind of drum you'd expect at a construction site or an old factory lot, not tucked into state park woods far from any road. He opened it. Inside were 2 bodies, wrapped in plastic, an adult woman and a young girl, both badly decomposed. Investigators arrived and did what any homicide unit does. They started building a profile. The woman was estimated to be somewhere between 23 and 33 years old. She had curly or wavy brown hair, stood between 5'2" and 5'7", and had extensive dental work, several fillings, and 3 extractions. The girl beside her was somewhere between 5 and 11, with wavy, light brown hair, a crooked front tooth, and a small gap in her smile. That's what they had. A physical description and nothing else. No missing persons report matched, no dental records lined up with anyone in the system. Her clothing, what remained of it after years of decomposition, offered no brand, no tag, no thread to pull. This was 1985, years before DNA testing became a standard part of police work, and long before anyone could run a genetic profile through a database and get a name back in seconds. Investigators were left with bones, teeth, and a drum, and none of it was talking. The psychology of the moment is important here. An unidentified victim isn't just a forensic problem, it's a kind of erasure. Somewhere, a family might have been searching. Somewhere, someone might have filed a missing persons report years earlier that never crossed paths with this case. But without a name, The woman and the girl existed in a kind of limbo, catalogued as evidence instead of remembered as people. Investigators publicized what they could, both in the United States and parts of Canada. At least 10 possible identities were floated and ruled out. Hundreds of leads came in over the following years. None of them held. Eventually, the case went quiet. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to look. Allenstown buried the woman and the girl in a local cemetery under a plain stone marker that read, "Here lies the mortal remains, known only to God, of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on the 10th of November, 1985, in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." No names, just a description carved into granite and a date. For the town of Allenstown, that grave became something close to a wound that never fully closed, a mystery without an ending, sitting quietly in their own cemetery. And for 15 years, that's exactly what it remained. 15 years passed. The grave marker in Allenstown weathered through 15 New England winters, and the case that had no name sat exactly where investigators left it, until May 9th, 2000, when a second search of that same patch of woods turned up something nobody expected: another barrel. This one sat about 100 yards from where the hunter found the first. Inside were 2 more girls. One was somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. The other was between 7 and 9. Both had been folded into the drum the same way the first 2 victims had, wrapped and hidden and left for the forest to swallow. What had been a double homicide was now something far worse. 4 victims, 3 of them children, a woman and 3 girls, dumped in barrels in the same stretch of park, likely within the same window of time. Autopsies confirmed all 4 had died from blunt trauma. Head injuries, consistent across every victim, adult and child alike. That single detail told investigators something important. This wasn't 4 separate tragedies that happened to end up in the same place. This was one event, or a series of closely connected ones, carried out by the same hand. And the disposal wasn't careless. Whoever did this didn't panic and dump a body on the side of a road. He wrapped each victim in plastic, sealed them inside heavy industrial drums, and carried them into a state park far enough off the beaten path that the first barrel sat undiscovered for 15 years, and the second sat less than a football field away, missed entirely during the original search. That's not the work of someone acting on impulse. That's the work of someone who planned, who understood how to make bodies disappear, and who came back to the same hidden location more than once, confident enough in the spot to use it again. What if I told you the killer had been standing in that same park, twice, years apart, doing the same thing both times, and investigators had no idea he existed? The second barrel didn't just add 2 more names to the unidentified list. It rewrote the entire case. This wasn't a single murder gone cold. It was a pattern. And patterns point to something investigators hadn't considered before. They weren't looking for someone who killed once in a moment of rage. They were looking for someone capable of doing this repeatedly, methodically, and getting away with it clean enough to walk out of those woods twice without leaving a trace behind. But knowing that didn't get them any closer to a name. 1985 had given investigators almost nothing to work with, and 2000 didn't change that. DNA science existed by then, but it wasn't advanced enough to pull a usable profile from remains that had spent decades exposed to soil, moisture, and time. The 4 victims went back into the ground of unresolved cases, and the file sat untouched for the next 17 years, waiting for forensic science to catch up to what the crime scene had already made clear. 17 years is a long time to wait for science to catch up to a crime scene. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, investigators kept the Bear Brook file open in name only. The tools that exist today, the ones that can pull a genetic fingerprint from a single strand of hair, simply didn't exist yet. What DNA testing could do at the time was narrow. It could confirm or rule out a match if investigators already had a suspect and a comparison sample. It couldn't reach into a database and hand them a name out of nowhere. So the file sat, and the 4 victims stayed exactly what they'd been since the day they were found: a woman and 3 girls with no identity attached. The first real movement came in 2014, when investigators ran a different kind of DNA test on the remains. This one looked at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child, generation after generation. The results confirmed something investigators had suspected, but couldn't prove. The adult woman and 2 of the 3 girls were maternally related. That meant the woman was very likely their mother, or possibly an aunt or older sister. But the family connection was no longer a guess. It was fact. That was progress. But mitochondrial DNA alone couldn't produce a name. For that, investigators needed something else entirely, a technique that barely had a name of its own at the time: genetic genealogy. Here's what that actually means. Genetic genealogy takes a DNA sample and compares it against the millions of profiles sitting in public ancestry databases, the same ones people use to build family trees or find long-lost relatives. Even without a direct match, the technique can identify distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share small fragments of genetic material with the unidentified person. From there, investigators build outward. They map family trees branch by branch, cross-referencing birth records, marriage records, obituaries, until the branches narrow down to one specific family, and eventually, one specific missing person. This had never been done before. Not once, anywhere, had genetic genealogy been used to identify a criminal suspect. It existed almost entirely in the world of hobbyists and adoptees searching for biological parents. Nobody had turned it toward a killer. The person who would end up doing exactly that was a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter. Before Bear Brook ever crossed her desk, Ray Venter had already used the technique to unravel a different mystery tied to the same unknown offender. A woman who had been kidnapped as a small child, raised for decades under a false identity, without ever knowing her real name or what had happened to her real mother. Ray Venter traced her back through fragments of DNA and distant family connections until the woman finally learned who she actually was. That case gave Ray Venter a blueprint, and in the years that followed, she turned that same blueprint toward the barrels in Bear Brook and toward the man who put 4 bodies inside them. The name that finally surfaced belonged to a man born December 23, 1943, in Denver, Colorado. Terry Peder Rasmussen, a name that meant nothing to anyone investigating Bear Brook, because he'd spent most of his adult life making sure nobody would connect it to him at all. Rasmussen didn't just hide. He reinvented himself, over and over, in different states, under different names, building new lives out of nothing, and abandoning them the moment they became inconvenient. Robert Bob Evans, Larry Vanner, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen. 4 separate identities, 4 separate paper trails, each one designed to keep the man underneath them invisible. Investigators would later call him the chameleon killer, and by the time they understood why, they'd already run into the twist that made this case unlike almost any other homicide investigation in the country. Terry Rasmussen was dead. He'd died in prison in December of 2010, years before anyone linked him to the barrels in Allenstown. The man they'd spent decades hunting had been sitting in a cell under yet another alias, and he passed away without ever knowing. Investigators 3,000 miles away were closing in on his real name. To understand how he ended up dead in a California prison cell, you have to go back to 1968, when Rasmussen married and settled with his wife in Phoenix and later Redwood City, California. They had 4 children together. His family would later describe him as physically abusive, and in 1975, his wife left him and took the children after he was arrested for aggravated assault. The last time that family saw him was around Christmas of 1974, when he showed up at their home with a woman none of them recognized. He never came back. The divorce finalized in 1978, and Rasmussen simply moved on, the way he would keep moving on for the next 3 decades. What finally caught him wasn't Bear Brook. It was Unsoon Jun, a chemist in California who Rasmussen married in an unofficial ceremony under the alias Larry Vanner. In 2001, Jun disappeared. Her body turned up buried in cat litter inside their own home, killed by blunt trauma to the head, the same cause of death investigators had already logged for all 4 Bear Brook victims. Rasmussen was arrested in November of 2002 and pleaded no contest the following year to her murder and dismemberment. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. That conviction, under an alias, for a crime 3,000 miles from New Hampshire, is what finally put him behind bars and eventually into a DNA database. And that's where the thread back to Bear Brook actually starts. Investigators ran DNA testing on the middle child recovered from the second barrel, and the results confirmed Rasmussen was her biological father. Not a suspect, not a person of interest. Her father, confirmed through genetic testing, tying him directly to one of the 4 bodies pulled from that New Hampshire drum. A father who murdered his own daughter and sealed her inside a barrel isn't a detail you move past quickly. But for investigators, it was also the first solid thread in a case that had produced nothing but dead ends for over 30 years. If Rasmussen fathered one victim, then his path, wherever it led, had crossed through New Hampshire at exactly the moment these murders happened. And unraveling that path meant unraveling every alias, every stop, every woman and child who crossed into his orbit and never made it back out. The woman found in that first barrel had a name long before investigators knew it, and that name was Marlise Honeychurch. 24 years old, living in Southern California. She'd already been married twice by the time she met Terry Rasmussen in 1978. Nobody in her family knew him as Terry. To them, he was just the man Marlise brought home for the holidays, a man who would end up being the last thing her family ever saw before she vanished. That happened on Thanksgiving, November of 1978, at her mother's house in La Puente, California. An argument broke out, described afterward as a small family dispute, nothing that seemed to carry any weight at the time. Marlise left the gathering that day with Rasmussen and her 2 daughters. Her family never heard from her again. Those daughters were Marie Elizabeth Vaughan, 6 years old, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, just 1. Both girls had fathers from Marlise's 2 earlier marriages, and both had lived through the kind of fractured custody arrangements common to young families pulled apart by divorce, shuffled between parents as circumstances changed. By October of 1978, Sarah's father had moved on to another relationship, and Sarah was presumably back in her mother's care. Marie had spent time with her own father too, before returning to Marlise. Whatever stability either girl had was already unsteady, long before Rasmussen ever entered the picture. From La Puente, the 4 of them, Marlise, Rasmussen, and the 2 girls, made their way across the country to Manchester, New Hampshire, where Rasmussen settled under yet another invented name, Bob Evans. He worked at a local mill, and a woman known as Elizabeth Evans was listed as his wife during that period. Investigators believe that woman was Marlise, though her use of that alias was never confirmed while she was alive to speak for herself. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery in terms of exact dates, but the broader outline is clear enough. Investigators believe Marlise, Marie, and Sarah were murdered sometime between 1978 and 1981, the same window in which Rasmussen was known to be living in Manchester as Bob Evans. Once they were killed, their bodies were carried into Bear Brook State Park and sealed inside that first barrel, the one the hunter would stumble across in 1985. But Marlise's daughters weren't the only children in that barrel's aftermath. The second barrel, the one recovered in 2000, held a girl between 2 and 4 years old, who bore no biological relation to Marlise or her daughters at all. DNA later confirmed that Rasmussen himself was her father. Sit with that for a moment. A man capable of killing a woman and her 2 young daughters, then killing his own child as well, and disposing of her in the same hidden location. Whatever calculation drove Rasmussen through each of his aliases and relocations, it apparently made no exception for his own blood. Investigators have never determined who her mother was, only that Rasmussen fathered her, and that she died the same way every other Bear Brook victim did. And Bear Brook wasn't the only place Rasmussen left a child behind. Years later, in a different state, under a different name, he would take another woman's daughter and raise her as his own, a pattern that would eventually become one of the clearest threads connecting him to a woman named Denise Beaudin. By 1981, Rasmussen had left Manchester, and he didn't leave alone. Denise Beaudin was 23, living in that same New Hampshire city, when she started seeing a man she knew as Bob Evans. She had a young daughter, just 6 months old. Sometime after Thanksgiving that year, Beaudin vanished. Her daughter vanished with her. Nobody reported it at the time, because Beaudin's own family believed she'd left town over money troubles, a plausible enough explanation that nobody thought to question it for years. What actually happened was simpler and worse. Rasmussen took the baby and kept moving. He resurfaced in California under yet another name, Larry Vanner, with a little girl he now called his own daughter. He raised her through the early 1980s, like a father raising his child, moving from place to place, alias to alias, and the girl grew up, believing that was exactly who he was. She had no reason to think otherwise. A child that young doesn't question the man who feeds her and signs her school forms. She called him her father because, as far as she knew, that's what he was. The psychology of that is worth sitting with. This wasn't a girl who lost her mother and grieved a gap in her life. She didn't know there was a gap at all. Her entire identity, her name, her family history, her sense of where she came from, had been built by the man who almost certainly murdered her real mother. She lived inside that lie for decades, unaware that the ground underneath her entire childhood was fabricated. Rasmussen eventually abandoned her in 1986 at a California RV park, under yet another alias. She grew up in foster care after that, still without any idea who she really was. The answer didn't come until 2016, when investigators turned to the same tool that would later crack Bear Brook wide open. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter took on the case, working alongside a detective who had spent years trying to trace the girl's real family through DNA fragments and distant cousins scattered across ancestry databases. Piece by piece, the family tree took shape, and it led directly back to Denise Beaudin, the woman who vanished from Manchester in 1981. For the woman who'd spent her whole life as someone else's daughter, that answer came with a second one attached, and there was no way to soften it. The man who raised her, fed her, told her who she was, had very likely murdered her actual mother. Investigators believe Rasmussen killed Beaudin somewhere in California, using the same method he'd use again and again. Blunt trauma, a body disposed of somewhere he alone knew. Denise Beaudin has never been found. No barrel, no burial site, no remains have ever surfaced. She remains missing to this day, presumed dead. One more name added to the list of women who crossed paths with Terry Rasmussen and never made it back out the other side. Her daughter, now grown, has chosen to keep her identity private, carrying forward a story that was never hers to be born into in the first place. By 2019, 3 of the 4 Bear Brook victims finally had names attached to them again. New Hampshire investigators held a press conference that June, confirming what months of quiet work had already established. The woman from the first barrel was Marlies Honeychurch, and the 2 girls beside her, across both barrels, were her daughters, Marie Vaughan and Sarah McWaters. Nearly 34 years after that hunter found the first drum, the mystery finally had faces attached to it that matched a name. That answer didn't come from a lab alone. It came from a Connecticut woman named Becky Heath, who spent years combing through online genealogy forums on her own time, searching for any thread connecting the case to a real family. Heath first noticed a post from someone searching for a half-sister named Sarah McWaters, a detail that meant nothing on its own until Heath matched it against birth dates and estimated ages from the Bear Brook file. She reached out to family members through online messages, and one of them mentioned, almost in passing, that Honeychurch had once been involved with a man named Rasmussen. For Heath, that single detail confirmed everything. She submitted her findings to investigators in October of 2018. At the same time, working independently, Barbara Ray Venter was solving the same puzzle from an entirely different angle. The DNA recovered from the victims had spent decades exposed to New Hampshire soil, and it had degraded far beyond what typical genetic genealogy required. Forensic scientists could pull mitochondrial DNA from the hair, but Ray Venter needed autosomal DNA, the kind found inside the cell nucleus, and nobody believed that was recoverable from hair without a living root attached. A California lab spent months developing a technique to reassemble those broken fragments piece by piece. It worked. That breakthrough gave Ray Venter a usable sample, and a forensic first that would go on to help solve cases far beyond Bear Brook. Two people, working separately, without knowing about each other's progress, arrived at the same family within weeks of each other. That's not a coincidence law enforcement usually gets to rely on. What that press conference actually returned wasn't just a set of names. It was 34 years of vigils held by Allenstown residents for two strangers they'd only ever known by a headstone. It was a family finally able to grieve someone specific, instead of an outline. The statement they released that day was brief. They'd carried heavy hearts, but they finally had the answers they'd been searching for. One name was still missing. The middle child, Rasmussen's biological daughter, remained unidentified for 6 more years, until 2025, when the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit partnered with the DNA Doe Project to take another pass at her case using genetic genealogy techniques that had only grown more capable since 2019. In September of that year, she finally had a name, Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California, daughter of Terry Rasmussen and a woman named Pepper Reed. Reed had been pregnant with Rhea when her own family last saw her, during Christmas of 1975 in Houston, Texas. They believed she'd moved to California afterward. They never heard from her again. Investigators now believe Reed is very likely another one of Rasmussen's victims, though her body, like Denise Baudin, has never been recovered. 40 years after the first barrel surfaced, every victim finally has a name. But the man responsible left at least one more disappearance behind him that still has no ending. Genetic genealogy gave 4 victims back their names after 40 years of silence, but it couldn't give every family an ending. Pepper Reed is still missing. No barrel, no grave, no answer. Just a mother whose disappearance matched a pattern investigators recognized far too late. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. If this case kept you company tonight, let it play on into the next one.